You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a PhD-holding historian, a professor, and the creator of History That Doesn't Suck, a podcast that makes legit, seriously researched American history come to life through entertaining stories. Join me for a chronological telling of the United States story, from the Revolution to fractious Civil War, tenacious inventors, brave reformers, and more. With more than 100 episodes, you can already binge listen your way from 1776 to the early 20th century. Listen to History That Doesn't Suck on Spotify.
Hey everyone, welcome to the very first episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast.
On July 4th, 1860, Americans at home and abroad sang patriotic songs, marched in parades, recited the Declaration of Independence, and raised glasses to toast the 84th birthday of the United States of America. 84 years wasn't very long when compared to the centuries-old stories of some European nations, but nonetheless Americans were proud of their country's short but dramatic history and of its place in the world. The nation was an unprecedented, if far from perfect, democratic republic, established by people determined to forge a future unspoiled by the tyrannies of the past.
Yet only months after those wonderful Independence Day celebrations, the states of the Deep South began seceding from the Union, and by February 1861, the American experiment in representative government teetered on the verge of failure. The resulting Civil War, fought through 4 Aprils between 1861 and 1865, would become, we think, the defining event in American history. Even today, a unifying thread woven throughout the fabric of America is our compelling need to remember the Civil War. Even today, the war seems somehow a part of us.
American history continues to move forward, and one might expect the Civil War to fade into the past, yet it shows no sign of doing so. As Americans, the Civil War is one of those subjects we both care about and feel we should care about. The United States has gone on to celebrate over 150 birthdays since the end of the Civil War in 1865, and each year of the country's existence brings remarkable accomplishments and formidable challenges. And those of us who love history understand that each challenge highlights the importance of moving into the future armed with the best possible understanding of the past.
As Abraham Lincoln said during the first year of the Civil War, quote, "The struggle of today is not altogether for today, it is for a vast future also." End quote. Lincoln endeavored to make clear to his listeners back then that the Civil War was worth fighting. Today, we're living in that vast future that Abraham Lincoln looked forward to, and we think the Civil War was not only worth fighting, but we think it's still certainly worth studying.
And that's really why we're doing this podcast, because the Civil War is worth studying, and it's worth studying because of what was at stake in the war, and because of how the war changed America. So, what was at stake in the war? Well, the Civil War settled 2 important questions. First, whether this fragile experiment in Republican government called the United States would survive as one nation, indivisible, and second, whether that nation would continue to endure half slave and half free. And in settling those 2 questions, the Civil War became the most dramatic, violent, and fateful experience in American history.
The Civil War was also the most tragic experience in American history. The heartbreaking tragedy is seen clearly in the war's human cost, with some 750,000 soldiers dying during the conflict, according to the latest research. And that figure doesn't even include an unknown number of civilians who lost their lives during the war.
It's kind of hard to actually wrap your head around those numbers, but to illustrate the immensity of that figure, it equals 2.4% of the American population in 1860, and if 2.4% of Americans were to lose their lives in a war fought today, the number of dead would be almost 7.5 million people. Seen in that light, it's easy to understand why the Civil War would be a traumatic experience in American history. But what truly made that experience an epic, defining moment in the nation's history is the fact that the hard hand of war not only dealt out death on the battlefields, it also ripped apart the social fabric of the nation. 4 years of fighting directly affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians and freed 4 million enslaved African Americans. It's no exaggeration to say that the Civil War quite literally changed the lives of every person, every American, soldier and civilian who lived through it.
So it's our goal that through this podcast we'll show how the experience of the Civil War forever defined the lives of those who lived through it, and that you'll also see how the war, by the long shadow that it cast, still touches the lives of Americans today.
It's been said, we think rightly, that the making or shaping of the country we live in today owes more to the Civil War than it does to the Founding Fathers. And for that reason alone, we think the war is still deserving of our study and attention today. The Civil War occupies an incredibly important place in our history. It was an epic turning point that transformed American culture and society.
As Rich and I set out on this project, we understand that today the Civil War means different things to different people. We know that besides being an epic turning point in our nation's history, the Civil War and its causes and its aftermath represent a complicated and controversial mix of issues that still, a century and a half later, still produces strong opinions and arouses intense emotions in people.
So please know that we aren't deliberately setting out on this project to push anyone's buttons, or rock the boat, or ruffle any feathers, or any other mixing of metaphors you can think of. We simply want to share with all of you our passion for history, and in the process tell the tragic and fascinating and still relevant story of a time in America's past when the issues that divided North and South were, to borrow a phrase from Abraham Lincoln, tried by war and decided by victory. And while we're talking about strong opinions and intense emotions, in the interest of full disclosure, we should probably mention right up front that we are married, to each other even, but I'm from Pennsylvania, and one of my ancestors fought for the Union. He served in the 57th Pennsylvania.
And I'm from Arkansas, and one of my ancestors was a slave owner.
But we kind of met in the middle, at grad school in Kentucky.
And now we live out west in Colorado, which is a state that's a bit short of Civil War history compared to our homes back east, but it is a beautiful place to live.
So all of that's to say that yes, we're married, and one of us is a Yankee, while the other is a Southern Belle, and we live in Colorado. And in the interest of full disclosure, we should probably also say that we're not historians. One of us does have a degree in history, and the other is a teacher, but as we start out with this project, we really see ourselves more as storytellers than historians. During the course of the podcast, we're not necessarily going to offer any startling new insights about the war or dredge up fresh interpretations of the standard issues. This isn't a PhD thesis, so it's not really our goal to reinvent the wheel.
Instead, from the vast wealth of excellent material about the Civil War that's already out there, we'll do our creative best to weave together a chronological narrative of the Civil War era that hopefully you'll find informative and also find some enjoyment in listening to.
Shelby Foote wrote a popular 3-volume history of the Civil War, and he was also interviewed extensively on Ken Burns' first-rate PBS series about the war. And Foote once said that as a nation, the Civil War, quote, was the crossroads of our being, and it was a hell of a crossroads, end quote. And we agree. As a nation, the Civil War was the crossroads of our being, and it was a heck of a crossroads. And since Tracy and I want to thoroughly explore that crossroads during the course of the podcast, we should probably admit right here and now that the show's title is a bit of a misrepresentation.
What Rich means is that the title of the show is The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. But we're actually going to expand our coverage beyond just those 4 years. And we're going to do that because it's not as if America was just cruising along and everything was wonderful, and then one day in April 1861, everyone was taken by surprise when a war suddenly and unexpectedly broke out.
That's not what happened at all, of course. And so we plan on taking a slow walk up to the start of the war. And that way we can take the time to look at some important and really interesting mileposts on that road that eventually led to war.
And then much farther along in the course of the podcast, after we make our way through the war itself, we also plan on looking at what happened after the Union military victory in 1865. That means we'll tackle the prickly but important topic of Reconstruction.
And we'll do that because it's not as if one day in 1865 the Civil War was suddenly over and everyone could simply go back to living the same lives they were leading before the war. That's not what happened at all. So we plan on taking the time to look at what happened, especially in the South, after the war. So that's our disclaimer, that since this is a history podcast, our coverage of the Civil War years will be bookended by the before and after, by the origins and the consequences and the aftermath of the conflict.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is The American Heritage Illustrated History of the Civil War.
Tracy and I both love to read, and we also hope that what you hear in each episode of the podcast might encourage you to dig deeper and explore for yourself what we've talked about. And so we plan on closing every show with a book recommendation for you guys. And for this show, it's a sentimental favorite of mine. This is the first book about the Civil War that I remember reading as a kid, or looking at, since I'm not even sure how old I would have been. But I clearly remember being fascinated by the maps in the American Heritage Illustrated History of the Civil War. And this is the old classic, with text by Bruce Catton and a ton of photographs and sketches and artwork, but what I loved were those bird's-eye view maps of the battles by David Greenspan, and I'm still pretty much a map geek today. Anyway, this book recommendation and all the others we share during the course of the podcast will be up on the show's website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
We'll usually end every episode with that show's book recommendation and maybe one or two announcements. But for this episode, we actually want to close instead with a quote that both Rich and I find very compelling. It's by a man who was born a slave, probably in the year 1818. While still in his teens, he was hired out to a notoriously brutal slave breaker in Maryland. But then in 1838, he escaped to the North in freedom. He went on to become an eloquent and powerful speaker, gaining fame as a leading spokesperson for the abolition of slavery and for racial equality.
That man was Frederick Douglass, and in 1871, after the Civil War was over, but at a time when the nation was still struggling with the consequences of the recent conflict, Douglass gave a speech which was a powerful call to remember not just the cost of the war, but what it was about and why it was worth fighting. Douglass said, "We are sometimes asked in the name of patriotism to forget the merits of this fearful struggle, and to remember with equal admiration those who struck at the nation's life and those who struck to save it, those who fought for slavery and those who fought for liberty and justice. I am no minister of malice. I would not strike the fallen. I would not repel the repentant. But may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I forget the difference between the parties to that terrible, protracted, and bloody conflict. If we ought to forget a war which has filled our land with widows and orphans, which has made stumps of men of the very flower of our youth, sent them on the journey of life, armless, legless, maimed, and mutilated, which has piled up a debt heavier than a mountain of gold, swept uncounted thousands into bloody graves, and planted agony at 1,000,000 hearthstones. I say, if this war is to be forgotten, I ask in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember?
What does Sputnik have to do with student loans? How did a set of trembling hands end the Soviet Union? How did inflation kill moon bases? And how did a former president decide to run for a second non-consecutive term? These are among the topics we deal with on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. We tell stories of history that relate to today's news events. Give a listen. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, wherever you get podcasts.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel like wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I like to call redacted history. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.